Beefalo taming. I used to hate it, but now I quite like taming a beefalo. But why, Jakey? Why tame a beefalo? Well, my child, aside from the new changes which makes riding beefalo for longer easier and reviving your beefalo if it dies, taming a beefalo has 3 key benefits: speed, infinite weapon, and meat shield. Speed. Riding a beefalo, even an untamed one, will result in movement speed much faster than the player, even while carrying heavy objects. Infinite weapon, or damage. Beefalo do at least 34 damage while being tamed, but once fully tamed, they can deal up to 68 damage per attack, which is the same as a dark sword. So a beefalo can be an infinite weapon. And meat shield, or health. While riding a beefalo, any melee attack damage you sustain gets applied to the beefalo and not you, the player. Beefalo have 1000 health and regenerate 6.9 health every 10 seconds, fully regenerating their health pool in 3 days. Beefalo also gain 4 times the health value when fed food compared to what a player would gain or lose. Combining all these benefits means you can fight with an unlimited weapon up to as good as a dark sword, always have access to enough speed to dodge boss attacks without switching gear between attacks, and if you get hit, the beefalo will take the full hit for you, after which the beefalo will regenerate the damage taken, something that players can't naturally achieve. All this while pooping enough to constantly fuel a fire pit throughout the entire year? Sounds good, right? That's because, well, it is. But taming a beefalo is a big investment, as it will take at least 15 to 20 days to achieve. But you can tame a beefalo while getting on with whatever else you usually do with the strategies I'll share in this video. That's the why, now it's time for the how. It is time to learn how to fully tame a beefalo, how domestication works under the hood, discuss Beefalo Saddle and other gear options, then I'll share practical strategies and tips for taming beefalo by taming a beefalo in 20 days from scratch in a new world. Your journey begins with actually finding a wild beefalo. Beefalo can be naturally found in the big savanna biome and in the mini savanna patch in the mandrake forest biome. Savanna turf in other biomes will not have beefalo. These biomes include the starter biome, triple mactus biome, and the dragonfly biome. Once you've found a beefalo, go to a science machine and craft yourself a Beefalo Bell. You can use this bell on a beefalo to attach it to the bell and give it a name. Now that beefalo will always stay near that Beefalo Bell, so keep a hold of this Beefalo Bell and the beefalo will always follow you, including following you into the caves. Or if you get too far away from the beefalo, like jumping through a wormhole, the beefalo will teleport to you. With the bell attached to a beefalo, pressing the attack key or clicking on the beefalo with something resembling a weapon equipped will still attack the beefalo. This has ramifications later, so be careful not to attack your beefalo. You'll also want to visit an alchemy engine and craft yourself a Beefalo Saddle. This Beefalo Saddle will provide your beefalo with a 40% speed boost while it's being ridden. But don't put it on the beefalo just yet, as it's time to talk about the beefalo stats that you must think about while taming your beefalo. These stats are obedience, domestication, and tendency. So how do I ride the beefalo? Well, cowboy, by using obedience. Obedience is a stat which increases by 10% each time you feed your beefalo anything, even things that don't give hunger, like light bulbs or petals. The beefalo will act differently with a saddle based on how high its obedience is. If its obedience is below 10% and you try to put a saddle on the beefalo, it will attack you. If its obedience is below 40%, the beefalo will shake any saddle off. And finally, at 50% obedience and above, you can mount the beefalo while it has a saddle on. Therefore, at least 50% obedience is what you want to maintain, so you can hop onto the beefalo and so it never shakes the saddle off. If your beefalo is below 50% obedience and you try to mount it, it will do a bucking animation. When this happens, simply and quickly feed the beefalo a few items like petals or light bulbs to bring its obedience up. Though obedience does steadily decrease over time, the speed of which is dependent on whether your beefalo is starving or not. Obedience drops by 150% per day over the course of the day if the beefalo's hunger is at 0 for the entirety of the day, or 18.75% every minute. If the beefalo's hunger is above 0 for the entirety of the day, then its obedience will drop by 50% over the course of the day, or 6.25% every minute. Obedience also drops by 1% every time the beefalo gets hit. If the beefalo's obedience drops below 50% while you're riding it, it won't buck you off early, but just be aware that it will continue to drop as the beefalo is being ridden. So be ready to feed it something when it bucks you off, or you get off, so it doesn't shake off its saddle. When a saddle is shaken off, it drains the durability of the saddle. If this happens too much, your saddle will break. If your beefalo goes to sleep before you fed it, then attempting to mount it will wake it back up. Then you can feed it before mounting it again. If the beefalo shook off its saddle at then went to sleep, it's harder to wake it up as you don't want to attack it nor have it attack you. You can try moving away with the Beefalo Bell to wake it up, or setting something on fire underneath the Beefalo to wake it up. Then feed it a few times to put the saddle back on and remount it. If your Beefalo Bell is inside storage of some kind like Chester or a chest, the Beefalo will not let you mount it. Avoid this by having the Beefalo Bell on the floor or in your inventory or equipped backpack. Regardless of your Beefalo's obedience, if the Beefalo is attacking something, it will not let you mount it, unless you use a few special saddles that we'll talk about later. It will also not let you feed it while it's in combat. This is significant since mobs usually take double damage from most boss mobs compared to if that boss mob hit you, the player. This also applies to your Beefalo when you're not riding it, but while you are riding it, your Beefalo takes the reduced player damage. Domestication, or more accurately, domestication points, are accumulated over time by either riding the Beefalo or making sure that it's fed until you reach 100% domestication, when your Beefalo becomes fully domesticated. Once you've started the domestication process by feeding the Beefalo anything that it can eat, being any kind of vegetation, fruit, vegetable, or vegan crockpot dish, a domestication tick will happen once every 10 seconds. When this tick happens, it will check for two things. Firstly, is the Beefalo mounted by a player? If yes, then you will gain the domestication point from that tick. If it's not being ridden, then it will instead check if the Beefalo's hunger is above 0. If yes, then you'll gain the same domestication point. If you accomplish this without fail, you will gain 5% total domestication per day, meaning you'll fully domesticate the Beefalo in 20 days. When riding, you'll be gaining domestication points, so there's nothing extra to do there, even if your Beefalo is starving. But while not riding and you want to feed the Beefalo for domestication points, there's a little more to it. A Beefalo has 375 max hunger and drains 300 hunger per day. Feeding a Beefalo a vegetable item or dish will give the Beefalo the same amount of hunger points that it would give you, but Beefalo's hunger drains 4 times faster than yours. For example, 1 carrot will keep the Beefalo fed for 20 seconds, while a twig will keep it fed for 15 seconds. But the best thing to feed a Beefalo for hunger efficiency-wise is steamed twigs. You can make these in a crock pot by using at least 1 twig, and then up to 3 fruits, vegetables, ice, or 3 more twigs. This crock pot recipe will give a Beefalo 100 hunger, which keeps them fed for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, or 1/3 of an in-game day, while 3 steamed twigs will keep a Beefalo fed for an entire day, gaining domestication points throughout that day. But don't overfeed your Beefalo. If you feed your Beefalo such that its hunger results in being above 300, your Beefalo will fart. This doesn't do anything negative, but it's an in-game warning to stop feeding the Beefalo, because if you overfeed the Beefalo by feeding it such that its hunger would have been pushed past 375, the Beefalo will puke up some rot and you will lose 1% domestication, which is the equivalent to about 10 domestication ticks or 1 minute and 40 seconds worth of domestication point accumulation. Overfeeding is easily avoided though, as Beefalo will beg for food when its hunger is below 168.5 or 45% max hunger. If it doesn't beg for food, that means its hunger is above 168.5 and you don't need to feed it for at least 4.5 minutes or over half an in-game day. The last way to gain domestication is by using a brush crafted at an alchemy engine. Once per day, brushing a Beefalo will give it a flat 1.67% domestication and 40% obedience, while also giving you 1 free Beefalo wool. Brushing any additional times during the same day will do nothing extra except use durability on your brush. If you do this once per day, every day from the start while otherwise domesticating the Beefalo perfectly, it can reduce the domestication time from 20 days to 15 days, which is a substantial speed up. But this brush requires steel wool from a Yucus and a walrus tusk from a Mactusk. Yucus are quite uncommon or rare to find from dirt piles in the early game, and you can't get a walrus tusk until winter, or if you get lucky from a treasure chest in the ocean and get a walking cane then deconstruct it to a tusk, but that's a lot of effort. I wanted to mention the brush because of course it is a great Beefalo taming tool, but usually by the time you could have got it, you could have already tamed your Beefalo almost all the way anyway, so I wouldn't put a lot of effort into getting this brush in the early game. Losing domestication. If you're not riding your Beefalo and its hunger is at 0 when a domestication tick happens, then you will not gain that domestication point. In fact, it's even worse. You'll also lose a very small amount of domestication. All the gains and losses in domestication points are very small decimals, so I'll describe them in comparison to how much positive domestication you gain every 10 seconds while the Beefalo is being ridden or fed. When you miss your first domestication tick, you will lose 0.1% of a positive domestication tick, or 1/960th of a positive domestication tick, which is tiny, that's not too bad at all. But this loss of domestication ramps up to 489/60ths, or 50% of a positive tick, after your Beefalo hasn't gained domestication from a tick for 10 days in a row. To avoid this, you just need to gain a tick between missing ticks to reset this ramping effect. This is to say, you probably want to be riding your Beefalo, and while not riding it, you want to keep it fed. And you especially do not want to attack your Beefalo. If you attack your Beefalo, it will lose 30% total domestication instantly. Not 30% of what you've accumulated, 30% flat, which is equivalent to losing 6 days worth of domestication progress. Don't set yourself back 6 days by attacking your Beefalo. I have done this too many times, and it's very annoying. Avoid this by always having your Beefalo saddled, as when a Beefalo is saddled, you really have to try very hard to attack it, as force attacking with Control F won't attack a saddled Beefalo, and things like Worm with the Bramble Husk and other area effect attacks will no longer hit your Beefalo if it's saddled. If your Beefalo isn't saddled, however, area effect attacks coming from yourself will hit your Beefalo, so be very careful not to hit or attack your Beefalo. If you need to leave your Beefalo for more than 1 day, so 3 steamed twigs won't cover the time that you're gone, then you can park your Beefalo near a salt lick or gourmet salt lick by dropping its Beefalo Bell right next to the lick to stop any passive domestication loss. A Beefalo within 5 tiles of this structure will lick it once every 60 seconds, and for those following 60 seconds, the Beefalo's domestication loss from not being fed or ridden is paused. And yes, that means, at least according to the code, a Beefalo's tongue must be at least 5 tiles long if it can still lick the salt lick even when it's 5 tiles away. If your Beefalo is near a salt lick but is still being ridden or fed, they still gain the domestication. The salt lick just prevents the passive loss of domestication while the Beefalo is within a 5 tile radius of it. Also, despite a Beefalo being fed, it will still lick a salt lick if it's nearby, which wastes usage of the salt lick, although while riding a Beefalo near a salt lick, it won't lick it until you dismount the Beefalo, which means riding the Beefalo near a salt lick doesn't waste the salt lick. If you have multiple licks close together, the Beefalo won't lick all of them, only one of them at a time, so feel free to make extra licks for longer periods of time of abandonment. The salt lick made of niter will last one Beefalo 2 hours or 15 in-game days of continuous domestication loss prevention until it breaks. The gourmet salt lick does the same thing, but it lasts twice as long, while it's also able to be repaired with salt crystals. Other animals like koalefants, grass gators, vault goats, and no idea will also be attracted to and use the lick. Thanks, Don't Starve Wiki, very cool. So don't turn your salt lick into an attraction or else it won't last very long at all. In typical gameplay, you probably won't need or use a salt lick unless you're abandoning your Beefalo for many days in a row, but there's no harm really in keeping one at your base if you want some extra insurance to prevent domestication loss. But as we discussed, you don't really lose a lot of domestication unless you abandon it for like a long time. Buck timer. These domestication points are essential to accumulate, as the more of them you have, the closer you are to fully taming the Beefalo. Along with that, as you get closer to taming the Beefalo, you can ride it for longer at a time before it bucks you off. We'll call this the buck timer. Starting with no domestication, a Beefalo will buck you off after a mere 15 seconds of ride time, including the mounting animation, causing you to go through a long and potentially dangerous animation before getting back on the Beefalo. This buck timer increases with more domestication, but as a few examples, when at 20% domestication or 4 days of domestication, your buck timer increases to 1 minute or 2 in-game segments. At 50% domestication, your buck timer will be over 2 minutes, then at 99% domestication, your buck timer will be around 4 minutes or half a day. And once your Beefalo is fully domesticated, the Beefalo will let you ride it for over 13 minutes, which is over 1.5 days. That's not all though. A very big change to Beefalo taming happened recently, where you can bypass this buck timer by simply feeding the Beefalo anything while riding it. This will reset its buck timer, which means you can theoretically ride it forever. This practically leads you to miss less domestication ticks while riding. This also increases your obedience like usual, and means you can heal Beefalo mid-fight by feeding it healing food. This addition means you can truly tame a Beefalo with a small number of resources and only miss a few or even 0 domestication ticks throughout the whole taming process. I'll showcase the strategy of using this new feature when I tame a Beefalo from scratch later in the video. Otherwise, if you're good at predicting when the Beefalo will buck you off, feed it something cheap like petals or a light bulb to reset the buck timer right before it would buck you off. Or if you're about to head into danger, like running through a monkey biome, feed the Beefalo something to reset the buck timer, then charge in. The biggest mistake that will get your Beefalo killed is you being bucked off at an inopportune time. Then it gets hit and engages in combat and you can't feed it to increase its obedience, nor can you mount the Beefalo. So this will lead your Beefalo to getting hit and just like dying while you watch painfully. So be careful around danger when riding your Beefalo. Although there are ways to counter this, which we will cover cover later. Beefalo in heat. If you're an experienced player, you'll know Beefalo go into heat throughout parts of the year. This is significant because while in heat, Beefalo become hostile to everything except other Beefalo, so riding them becomes a pain, unless you wear a Beefalo hat, then they'll become neutral to you again. This doesn't fix all the issues though, as a Beefalo in heat will have its buck timer reduced to 1/5 of its original time, meaning a fully undomesticated Beefalo in heat will buck you off after only 3 seconds. This doesn't directly affect the domestication you can gain, but if the Beefalo is bucking you off much more often, then you'll probably miss more domestication ticks. Beefalo will always go into heat for the entirety of spring except the last day of spring, then also 3 days in autumn and winter, just not in your first autumn. In your first Don't Starve year, the Beefalo heat calendar will look like this: the first 3 days of winter and the entirety of spring except the last day. And every year after that, the heat calendar will look like this. Every autumn, the 5th through to the 8th day of autumn will be Beefalo in heat, and then the 8th to the 11th day of winter, where they will also be in heat. And then all of spring except the last day, they'll be in heat, and they will never be in heat in summer. Thankfully though, if your Beefalo goes into heat outside of spring, you can attach a Beefalo Bell to them if you haven't already, and drag them in and out of the caves, which will stop them being in heat, allowing you to tame them normally. If it's spring though, then there's no way to stop the Beefalo from going into heat, so either tame your Beefalo when it isn't spring, or if you insist on taming one in spring because you enjoy suffering, then ride the Beefalo onto a boat where it is trapped and won't attack anything, then feed it 3 steamed twigs per day so it gains domestication without you having to ride it. Or just abandon it on a boat with a salt lick or 2 so it doesn't lose domestication while you wait for spring to pass. Also, don't do the opposite of grooming your Beefalo, which is don't shave your Beefalo. If you shave your Beefalo, it will be sad and will reduce its buck timer by 1/5 again, until of course its wool grows back in 3 days. If your Beefalo is shaved and in heat, then you can't even get past the mounting animation before the Beefalo bucks you off. Finally, we have tendency. Your Beefalo has 4 tendencies: Rider, Ornery, Pudgy, and Default. You can tell which tendency your Beefalo has based on the face it makes. While you're still taming the Beefalo, this tendency does nothing to your Beefalo stats. But once it's fully domesticated, it will gain stats based on the tendency that its face has. You can tell when a Beefalo is fully tamed because once its domestication hits 100% and then you feed it something, a quick flash will happen and the Beefalo's wool will have a combed look to it, and the tendency it had when it transformed is the tendency it will be locked in with. But what does each tendency do when fully domesticated? Firstly, all fully tamed Beefalo gain a minimum level of obedience, which is all greater than 40%. This means once they're fully tamed, they will never shake off their saddle. Otherwise, here are the tendency's effects. Rider Beefalo moves the fastest of all the Beefalo, moving almost as fast as a player with a walking cane, Magiluminescence on a cobblestone path with the default saddle equipped, but only deals 25 damage while also having 95% minimum obedience. Ornery Beefalo move as fast as an untamed or default Beefalo, but its damage is increased from 34 to 50. Their downside though is they have a minimum obedience of 45%, which if you remember means you need to feed it something to mount it, as you require 50% obedience to mount a Beefalo. Pudgy Beefalo are the slowest type of Beefalo, deal the least damage being 20, but have a sanity aura of plus 6.25 per minute, while having a minimum obedience of 60%. Default Beefalo are literally the same as a wild Beefalo. It moves as fast as an Ornery, deals the default 34 damage, and has no other special abilities other than having a minimum obedience of 80%. To gain a specific tendency, you need to accumulate those specific tendency points, of which there are 3 types. Also note that tendency points are separate from domestication points, they just happen to accumulate in a similar manner. You will gain rider points every second while you're mounted on the Beefalo, at a rate of 1 2,400th. You will gain Ornery points every time the Beefalo attacks or is attacked while mounted, at a rate of 9.6 out of 2,400. This includes when you range attack while on top of the Beefalo. Sorry, Walter. And you will gain Pudgy points every second while the Beefalo's hunger is above 50% at a rate of 1 2,400th. Clearly, it's easy to gain all 3 kinds of tendency points while taming your Beefalo, but thankfully, the trait your Beefalo will gain is determined by whichever tendency has more points compared to the sum of the other 2 tendencies. So if you want a rider Beefalo, make sure to ride it around a lot and don't do too much attacking. If you want an Ornery Beefalo, do lots of attacking or getting hit. And if for some reason you want a Pudgy Beefalo, then make sure you feed it above 187.5 hunger, which means make sure it's never begging for food and feed it until it farts. And otherwise, don't do too much attacking or riding. If you manage to balance the tendencies such that any one tendency doesn't have more points than the sum of the other 2, then you will have a Beefalo with default tendency. So which tendency is best when fully tamed? Well, I basically always go for a rider Beefalo because I primarily use Beefalo for traveling around around fast, and I fight on my feet with melee weapons. But fighting on top of a Beefalo is very comfy, so you may want to go for an Ornery Beefalo for the extra damage, as fighting on any Beefalo means your Beefalo will take all the melee attack damage you're hit with, while you, the player, only take damage from effect damage and range attacks which target you rather than the Beefalo. This includes mobs like Mactusk, Clockwork Bishops, and oddly, Electrified Vault Goats. Otherwise, Ornery Beefalo have the downside of needing to be fed to increase their obedience to hop back onto them, which can catch you off guard in a bad situation. Default Beefalo offer 34 damage, not as good as Ornery's 50, but better than Pudgy and Riders, while having a minimum obedience of above 50%, so you never need to increase its obedience to mount it. And I don't know why you'd ever go for a Pudgy Beefalo. Meat sword. The only thing I would say about tendencies is that if you want anything but an Ornery Beefalo, be careful with how much attacking you do, since if you continuously attack with your Beefalo, you'll be gaining over 17 times the Ornery points than Rider points over the same time period. It's incredibly easy to accidentally make your Beefalo an Ornery Beefalo, so pay attention to your Beefalo's face. If it turns from Rider to Default or Ornery and you want a Rider Beefalo, perhaps stop attacking for a while and let your Rider points overtake your Ornery points. Or if your Beefalo is a Rider or Pudgy but you want a Default or Ornery Beefalo, then build yourself a punching bag and continuously attack it for risk-free Ornery points. Thanks, Alan, for this tip. Now that your Beefalo is fully domesticated, you don't need to take care of it anymore, right? Wrong. When the Beefalo's domestication hits 100% and you feed it something, it will transform, gain its tendency stats, no longer beg for food, and gain its minimum obedience, so never shakes its saddle off. Cool. But its domestication value will continue to fall and rise based on the rules we established earlier. This means if you abandon your Beefalo for long periods of time, its domestication will drop significantly. This doesn't change your Beefalo's stats or minimum obedience, no matter if your domestication goes from 100% to 99% or from 100% all the way down to 1%, it will just affect the buck timer a little. When the Beefalo is tamed with the combed hair, the buck timer scales differently than while taming. While tamed, the buck timer scales linearly from 13 minutes and 20 seconds at 100% domestication to about 7 minutes at 50% domestication, all the way down to about 50 seconds at 0.1% domestication. But domestication really matters if it goes all the way down to 0%. Then the Beefalo will untransform back into a wild Beefalo, losing all its stats, tendency points, and minimum obedience, and you will need to domesticate it from scratch. I've played worlds with domesticated Beefalo, and I've never had a Beefalo fully undomesticate. During these worlds, I never fed the Beefalo after domestication was completed, and I never parked the Beefalo at a salt lick, although I used them very often to ride around the map and to travel to and from boss fights. But given enough time of underutilization, the Beefalo will eventually become undomesticated. I'm going to give some practical examples of how long it takes for a Beefalo to become undomesticated, so you can get an idea of what you can and cannot get away with when caring for your domesticated Beefalo. If you never ride or feed your Beefalo while also not leaving a salt lick nearby, it will take 45 consecutive days for the Beefalo to become undomesticated. It becomes undomesticated that fast because it was abandoned for longer than 10 days in a row, which, if you remember, means that the amount of domestication lost per tick ramped up from 0.1% of a positive domestication tick to 50% of a positive domestication tick. But abandoning a Beefalo with 100% domestication, no hunger, and no salt lick for a smaller 8 minutes or 1 in-game day will result in domestication falling to 99.87%, and after those 8 minutes, it takes a grand total of 1 domestication tick, so 10 seconds of riding or being fed, to get the domestication back up to 99.97%, then 1 more tick to get it back to 100%. So yeah, you really don't need to use your Beefalo a lot to stop the Beefalo from losing domestication. Of course, the domestication loss scales harder based on how long you abandon the Beefalo for without it gaining any passive domestication points. So here's 3 more examples. Abandoning the Beefalo for 5 consecutive days or 40 minutes will result in the Beefalo's domestication dropping to 96.86%. This requires about 5 minutes or just over half a day of riding or being fed to get back up to 100% domestication. Abandoning the Beefalo for 10 consecutive days will result in the Beefalo's domestication dropping to 87.47%. This requires 20 minutes or about 2.5 days of riding or being fed to get back up to 100% domestication. And finally, abandoning the Beefalo for 20 consecutive days or an entire season will result in the Beefalo's domestication dropping to 62.42%. This requires 7.5 days or about 1 whole hour of riding or being fed fed to get back up to 100% domestication. If you have a brush, you can offset this loss potentially fully by brushing your domesticated beefalo once every 29 minutes or 3.6 days. Although this kind of domestication gain doesn't reset the ramping effect of domestication loss, which means you need to ride the beefalo for 10 seconds after brushing to reset the ramping effect, since brushing more often isn't enough. This is all to say, you really need to frequently abandon your beefalo for long periods of time and not use your beefalo a lot to make it lose all of its domestication. And if you use your beefalo so infrequently such that it becomes undomesticated, you probably won't miss it when it's gone. As long as you ride your beefalo once per day for 20 seconds or have it fed for 20 seconds per day, it will never become undomesticated. But of course, for insurance, you can leave a salt lick at your base to prevent domestication loss, but you probably don't need it. Saddles and equipment. I've told you how to tame a beefalo and all of the domesticated tendency stats, but what about saddles and other beefalo equipment? There are 5 saddles you can potentially choose from, each offering different stat boosts. Let's go over them and see which is best. Firstly is the saddle horn. This isn't a saddle itself, but can be used 5 times to remove a saddle without the saddle losing durability. This could be handy if you plan to gain domestication by only feeding steamed twigs, like in spring, and therefore the beefalo will shake its saddle off due to its obedience dropping, causing the saddle to lose durability. Usually you won't need this, and you can also remove saddles without losing durability by swapping a different saddle onto the beefalo. The default saddle you will almost definitely start off with. This gives your beefalo a 40% speed boost while riding it. This makes riding an untamed beefalo faster than a player with a walking cane and a magic luminescence. Real quick, a beefalo's speed is calculated based on their base speed and the saddle they're wearing, while ignoring every other speed bonus like cobble road, walking canes, etc. Except oddly, Wolfgang's leg day skill works. Anyway, each beefalo tendency have their own base speeds. Rider's speed is 8, but amplified by 1.4 times by the saddle to make it speed 11.2. Ornery and default beefalo's speed is 7, but is amplified to 9.8. Pudgy's speed is 6.5, amplified to 9.1, while a player moves at a speed of 6 with no speed multipliers. The next saddle you'll probably be able to craft at an alchemy engine is the Gossamer Saddle. It has a hefty cost of 2 living logs, 4 silk, and 68 butterfly wings. Consider using a construction amulet to make this saddle, as getting 68 butterfly wings will take you at least 4 autumn days of hunting butterflies, but probably longer. Though if you're in multiplayer, you can expect more butterflies to spawn, scaling based on how many players are near flowers. This saddle is worth it though. It grants your beefalo a huge 55% speed bonus. This makes a rider beefalo with a Gossamer Saddle get a speed value of 12.4, so travels over twice as fast as a player with no speed bonuses, which is faster than a player with a cane, a magic luminescence, and a cobblestone path. The War Saddle you may be able to acquire a bit deeper into the mid-game, as it requires some more of that darn steel wool from Eucus to craft. The need for the wool makes it bad enough, but it requires 4 of it. 1 Eucus will only drop 2 or 3 steel wool, so again you'll need a construction amulet or kill multiple Eucus, otherwise it requires 10 logs and 4 rabbits to craft. You can technically get steel wool from Claus's sack, but who's doing that? This saddle provides only a small 25% speed bonus, but grants the beefalo 16 extra physical damage on each attack, increasing an Ornery's attack damage from 50 to 66, or a 32% damage boost. This saddle is of course good damage, but you take a hit on the speed being only 25%. This makes an Ornery beefalo with the War Saddle a little bit slower than a player with a walking cane and magic luminescence. But something this saddle has that I haven't mentioned yet is this saddle counts as a combat saddle. But what does that mean? A combat saddle allows you to mount a beefalo even if it's attacking something and in combat. Normally if a beefalo attacks something while you're not riding it, you cannot mount the beefalo. This usually manifests as your beefalo getting hit by a boss or a particularly strong mob, and since your beefalo attacks very slowly, it'll die to the boss or strong mob. Sometimes even if you try to help the beefalo by killing the enemy faster. If you run away holding the Beefalo Bell, it might work if you run far enough, fast enough, so your beefalo unloads and teleports to you, but if you don't unload it fast enough, or at all, it will ignore you and probably die. Of course, if your domesticated beefalo dies, you are incredibly sad because it took a lot of time and effort to domesticate it. With a combat saddle though, you can hop onto the beefalo even if it's in combat, and ride it out of trouble, or use the beefalo to kill the enemy, since of course, beefalo attacks a lot faster while you're riding it. The other ways to avoid your beefalo dying to a boss if you're not using a combat saddle is by putting everything to sleep and mounting your beefalo, relogging so everything will be de-aggroed, and taking the Beefalo Bell your beefalo is attached to and throwing it into a wormhole or going into a sinkhole. This will force the beefalo to unload away from the fight by teleporting to the other side of the wormhole or coming into the caves with you. Also, before a boss fight, you can drop the bell a screen or two's distance away away to ensure the Beefalo stays away from the fight, as Beefalo have a tendency of wandering towards you away from their Beefalo Bell until they get like 4 or 5 tiles away from their bell, and then they run back to the bell. It can be quite annoying. You can avoid your Beefalo getting hit in most circumstances, but where battle saddles are quite necessary is if you're using your Beefalo in a fight versus a boss that has knockback attacks, like Nightmare Werepig, Armored Berger, and Frostjaw. These knockback attacks will always knock you off your Beefalo and leave your Beefalo vulnerable to aggro onto the boss. Without a battle saddle, these fights would be night-night for your Beefalo, but even with the battle saddle, Armored Berger will still say goodnight to your Beefalo if you get knocked off, so be careful. This is great for all Beefalo, except Ornery. Kind of. You see, since Ornery Beefalo have a minimum obedience of 45%, you usually have to feed them before you can mount them. So even if your Ornery Beefalo has a combat saddle and is attacking something, you can try to mount it, but if its obedience is below 50%, then you can't mount it. So you then try to feed the Beefalo to increase its obedience, but the Ornery Beefalo won't let you feed it because it's in combat, meaning regardless of if the Ornery Beefalo has a combat saddle or not, it'll be stuck fighting something since you still can't mount it because stupid Ornery Beefalo have minimum obedience below 50%. It's a vicious cycle, and I basically just mean the Ornery Beefalo are annoying and I hate them. I tried to be unbiased up until now, but I can't contain my rage. I hate Ornery Beefalo so much, they're so annoying. Did you know if you fed gunpowder to an Ornery Beefalo, it will transcend to godhood? Anyway, you may want to avoid this by maxing out your Ornery Beefalo's obedience before beginning a fight. Anyway, so that's what combat saddles do. The war saddle and the next 2 saddles count as combat saddles. If you're playing Wilfred, you're in luck, as on her skill tree she unlocks the battle saddle. This saddle requires marble, gold, and azure feathers, meaning you won't be getting this saddle until winter, since azure feathers are dropped by snowbirds that only spawn in winter. This saddle can be used by anyone and grants 30% movement speed, so a little slower than the default saddle, but more than the war saddle. It also grants 5 physical damage to each Beefalo attack, a lot less than the war saddle's 16 bonus damage, but it also grants your Beefalo 40% damage reduction, which is something none of the before mentioned saddles do. This 40% damage reduction is free, it doesn't cause the durability of the saddle to go down. This means your Beefalo can get hit for 1666 damage before dying, compared to before where they would die after being hit for 1000 damage. Despite the weak movement speed and damage, the damage reduction is quite neat, but I'd rather have either more speed or more damage and skip the damage reduction, since if your Beefalo is taking close to 1000 damage with the default saddle, you're probably doing something wrong. The last saddle is the Nightmare Saddle. This is by far the most expensive saddle, as it requires you to have activated the cave risk by killing Agent Fuel without giving Dreadstone to the Shadow Hand, then it requires possessing a Shadow Atrium by feeding to a Mimic and acquire a lot of Dreadstone, Pure Horror, and Dark Tatters to craft it. Man, I did that in one take, that's sick. I would recommend using Construction Magic to make and duplicate the saddle for lots of endgame shadow materials. Once you have this saddle equipped, it grants 45% movement speed bonus, 18 bonus planar damage to each Beefalo attack, and grants 60% physical damage reduction, along with 15 flat planar damage reduction. My goodness, wow. This saddle really has it all, except it has even more. A Beefalo with this saddle will also deal 10% more damage to lunar enemies and receive 10% less damage from shadow enemies. Comparison time. This saddle's 45% speed is better than the default saddle's 40%, but it's not as good as the Glossman's 55%. Its damage is usually better than the war saddle, since the war saddle provides 16 damage, which can be buffed by physical damage multipliers like Abigail's Vex, whereas the Nightmare Saddle has 18 power damage, which isn't buffed by things like Abigail's Vex. Despite this, it's still usually the best damage, especially when fighting a planar enemy. And finally, the massive 60% damage reduction is better than the battle saddle's 40%, allowing your Beefalo to be hit for 2500 damage before dying. Overall, this saddle is of course the best, except if you are specifically using a rider Beefalo and you really want to have maximum speed and you never attack, so you'd prefer to use the Glossamer saddle. But of course, this saddle also counts as a combat saddle, so you can hop onto your Beefalo during combat, which is a good way of stopping your Beefalo from dying, like we said before. In a usual game, I go straight from using the default saddle to the Nightmare Saddle, especially if Fuel Weaver is my primary target for the first couple of seasons. The main reason for going for the Nightmare Saddle so early for me is so my Beefalo doesn't die from attacking a boss that I can't pull the Beefalo away from, because that would be dumb and make me sad. If you have access to all the saddles, then there are very clearly early, mid, and late game saddles, so ultimately, in my opinion, you're picking between the Glossamer and the Nightmare Saddle. Before we talk about Beefalo and saddle combinations, let's see if there's a way of undoing a Beefalo's dumb mistakes without a combat saddle. The Beefalo Gloom Bell costs the same materials as the Nightmare Saddle, but in different amounts, so it's still very expensive and you won't acquire it until the end game content is unlocked in the caves. This Gloom Bell works the same as a normal Beefalo Bell, except for 3 abilities. Firstly, when it's dropped, it floats in the air, so it's easy to see where you've dropped it at, which is pretty neat. Secondly, the bell makes any poop from the Beefalo vanish after 5 seconds. Wow. But the best ability, of course, is if the Beefalo attached to the gloom bell dies, you can use the gloom bell on the Beefalo's corpse to revive it. After doing this, you'll receive a massive half max health penalty, 100 sanity loss, and the reviving ability of the gloom bell will go on a massive cooldown of 2 hours. Though, if your Beefalo dies and you disconnect or switch to the caves or come back from the caves before reviving the Beefalo's corpse will unbond and be dead forever. This is a great bit of equipment as you can use whichever saddle you'd like without the worry of the Beefalo dying. Of course, you'd rather the Beefalo not die, since then it's vulnerable to being deleted forever while the gloom bell is on cooldown, but it's still a great failsafe. Also, if you make multiple gloom bells, after your Beefalo dies once and you revive it, you can then break the bond from that first bell and reattach the Beefalo to a second gloom bell that isn't on cooldown. The first gloom bell will still be on a long 2-hour cooldown, but at least you can still have that failsafe with the second gloom bell. Now you know all the Beefalo gear you potentially have at your disposal, let's compare saddles on each kind of Beefalo by looking at this handy chart I made to see their stats. While you look at the numbers, this basically boils down to having a max speed rider Beefalo, a maxed out damage ornery Beefalo, a speed ornery Beefalo with a Glossmere saddle to move fast while still doing 50 damage, or downgrading to a default Beefalo with a damage saddle to have good damage without having to deal with the below 50% obedience of the ornery Beefalo. This to say, Glossmere and Nightmare saddles are the best performing saddles, with Nightmare saddle overall providing the most value to each Beefalo. Beefalo also have access to a structure called the Beefalo Grooming Station. You can use this to modify your Beefalo skins, but the practical application for this structure is while holding the Beefalo bell, you can hitch your Beefalo to this station. This causes the Beefalo to stick like glue to the station no matter what. Unless, of course, the Beefalo gets hit, then it will become unhitched. This is useful while you're at since Beefalo naturally walk very close to you, which can get very annoying, or even result in a misclick causing you to attack your Beefalo. So build the structure in your base. Beefalo Treats is a crockpot dish you can make and feed to your Beefalo to grant only 25 hunger, but give them 300 health. They do require forget-me-lots to make, which can be a pain to mass produce, so check out this video by Latinish Monster to farm them easily. You'll probably never need to heal your Beefalo, and if you do, then you'll probably just use blue caps, but hey, if you want to mix these, you can. Just remember your Beefalo regenerates all its health in 3 days, so healing food isn't normally necessary. Although when your Beefalo's health drops below 200 and you're riding it, the bottom of the screen will have a red gradient to indicate that your Beefalo is hurting. If this happens, I'd either get your Beefalo away from danger for 1 or 2 days, or feed it some healing food so it doesn't die. I have told you all the stats, the facts, gear, and mechanics behind Beefalo taming, but now let's put it all into practice by actually taming a Beefalo and sharing tips and strategies from scratch. For this gameplay example, I'm going to be playing Wilson with no skills in a new world, and my goals will be to get a Beefalo as soon as possible, begin taming it, outline the entire map, rush the ruins, build a base, and do preparations for winter, then survive winter until my Beefalo is fully tamed, while exceeding my own expectations. Alright, let's go. I started by doing the standard grass, twigs, flint, logs, and gold gathering, but I'm also picking berries and picking petals. The berries will be used as filler for steamed twigs, and petals will be used to increase the obedience of the Beefalo when I come to riding it. Then I spotted a forest, and on closer inspection, it had savanna turf, which means it's the Mandrake Forest, which will have Beefalo in it. After finding this, I head there with the Beefalo bell, then hook a Beefalo to the bell while also feeding it a few carrots. This gets the domestication process started as the Beefalo's hunger is above 0. That means I started the domestication process 11 segments into day 2. Remember this for later. Also remember that each carrot is 20 seconds of hunger for a Beefalo and a twig is 15 seconds of hunger for a Beefalo. I don't have an alchemy engine yet, so can't make a saddle, so instead I burn some trees and craft a crockpot. This crockpot will allow me to make steamed twigs using the berries I was gathering earlier. 3 berries and 1 twig gets steamed twigs, which is 1/3 of a day's hunger for Beefalo. I continue to do this to keep the Beefalo gaining domestication while I continue to progress to an alchemy engine and beyond, which took a few days. I kept this in mind before leading the Beefalo a screen away so I could kill some of its herd members for Beefalo wool. I had to of course take my Beefalo off screen before doing this, otherwise it would try to attack me, which doesn't cause any domestication loss, but it would make it easier to accidentally attack my Beefalo. Whenever the Beefalo begged for food, I just fed it a steamed twig. That's a surefire way of knowing it's not losing domestication due to having and low hunger. Although it will mean the Beefalo will gain a small amount of Pudgy points, but that won't cause any tendency problems later. I hammer the crockpot during day 4 since I have 2 days worth of steamed twigs in my inventory, and at the end of day 4 I have my alchemy engine, which means I can craft Beefalo Saddle among the other usual suspects. Here I find and feed a potato to my Beefalo and it pulls a funny face. This face means whatever I just fed the Beefalo damaged its health, and since they quadruple that value, that means they took quadruple the damage. This doesn't reduce domestication or anything, it just indicates that you fed it something that hurt it, and it still grants the Beefalo the hunger from that food. After making a few more steamed twigs, I feed 6 petals to my Beefalo to get its obedience to above 50%, and then equip the saddle and start riding the Beefalo at the start of day 6. Since I gained the first 3.5 days worth of domestication by feeding it, I didn't have to deal with a really short and annoying buck timer, so now my buck timer is about 50 seconds. I continue exploring and gathering all the usual materials, storing it in my piggyback. This backpack has more space than a normal backpack, but usually reduces your speed, but on a Beefalo it does not reduce your speed. The top tip strategy I've been alluding to is this: whenever I get off the Beefalo to do a quick task like hammering a pig house or any other activity I can't do while on a Beefalo, I feed a twig to the Beefalo before dismounting. This ensures that the Beefalo is fed for 15 seconds while I'm off of it, meaning as long as I time everything right, I should miss very few domestication ticks, even though I'm not always riding the Beefalo and not always feeding the Beefalo steamed twigs. Also, when I dismount, I always top up my Beefalo's obedience to make sure it doesn't shake off its saddle. Remember, when a Beefalo's hunger is at 0, it loses 18.75% obedience per minute, and while fed, it loses 6.25% obedience per minute. And you may have noticed my Beefalo's face has become smiley. That means my Beefalo has more rider points than the sum of Pudgy and Ornery points. I want to tame a rider Beefalo and plan to ride this Beefalo around a lot with not too much fighting, so it should be very easy for me to tame this Beefalo into a rider Beefalo. Remember though that even though the tendency is showing on its face, it does not gain the stats of that tendency until the Beefalo is fully domesticated. So the tendency right now does nothing other than indicate that I have more rider points than the sum of Ornery and Pudgy. While I was outlining the map, I decided to try and make a Glossimer saddle. This requires 68 butterfly wings, which is outrageous, but if I can manage to get 34 butterfly wings, store them in a fridge, and bring a construction amulet back from the ruins, I'll be able to craft the max speed saddle. I also wasted some time doing hunts to see if I could score a Yucus, which would allow me to make a brush, but my efforts bore no fruits as I only found koalefants. On day 11, I finished outlining the whole map and decided to base roughly in the middle of the map next to a wormhole with a sinkhole not too far away, remembering to feed my Beefalo steamed twigs if I was going to be dismounted for more than a minute. Glommer acquired. I prepared to rush the ruins by making all the usual stuff, and I made 13 steamed twigs, which is way more than enough, but oh well. Once in the caves, I found the muddy biome and picked a stack of light bulbs. This will be your main way of increasing your Beefalo's obedience for the rest of your taming journey, as you get multiple of them per pick animation. Unfortunately, it took me a bit longer than usual to find the ruins, but whenever I went into a dangerous biome, I fed a light bulb to the Beefalo to reset the buck timer, which by this time is probably about 2 minutes or so. Once in the ruins, I didn't want to do too much fighting with the Beefalo, so it didn't get too many ornery points, but I also didn't want to take a lot of damage myself because I brought no healing food, so when I needed movement speed to fight and dodge, I used the Beefalo. When fighting nightmares, I dismounted and killed them with my hairbat. When around rooks, I was extra careful to stay on the Beefalo and to not get bucked off, because while rooks only do 45 damage to me and my Beefalo while I'm riding it, it does 200 damage to other mobs, including my Beefalo while I'm not riding it. Rooks are a special case and do a lot more than double damage to mobs and would kill my Beefalo super fast, so I stay on my Beefalo around rooks. After navigating the longest and most windy Ancient Guardian labyrinth ever, like look at this, look at the path I had to take to get to Ancient Guardian, and I went the wrong way every time while exploring this labyrinth. It took so long to get to Ancient Guardian. Once I reached Ancient Guardian, I fed the Beefalo 2 steamed twigs, cancelling the eating animation by moving the Beefalo. Then I fed the Beefalo 5 light bulbs to top up its obedience, and left its bell far away from the center of the arena to keep it away from danger. This keeps it gaining domestication while I deal with Ancient Guardian. Ancient Guardian is defeated, I devour the Guardian Horn for healing, and recover my happy Beefalo.
Did you know if you feed a glow ray to a Beefalo, it glows?
The Ancient Guardian chest wasn't that good, as it didn't have green gems in it, and I definitely need green gems for the construction amulet for the Glossimer saddle that I want. After winding back through the labyrinth, I look for my second required green gem. Then I hunt down a station and get never mind. A rook broke it. Well, second green gem acquired, and broken station vanquished of evil. Being sure my Beefalo was fed with steam twigs, I repaired the station and killed off a horde of nightmare creatures, then finished crafting what I would typically craft in a boss rush, then started heading back out of the ruins. Before I leave the wild biome, I pick a stack of lichen. This lichen will be used to make, you guessed it, more steamed twigs. Lichen is very abundant down here, but spoils fast. So after grabbing a stack of that, I grab a stack of light bulbs, then I'm back on the surface. Yo, my butterfly wings are about to spoil. Success! Gossamer Saddle just made. I didn't think my butterfly was to be so close to spoiling. Yes! Gossamer Saddle acquired! Yes! Gossamer Saddle this early is so great. You may want to hold off on putting the saddle on your Beefalo if you're not doing a great job of keeping its obedience up and its saddles on, but otherwise easy speed bonus. Using all my lichen and other filler, I cook up 14 more steam twigs. This will be more than enough for the remainder of the domestication time. In the meantime, I start building twigs. It has some steam twigs. Also, oh, whoa! Day 23! Day 23! Befriend! Yes! My Beefalo may have had 100% domestication before the 4th segment of day 23, but it didn't trigger the domestication until I fed the Beefalo something. But damn, that's a fast domestication time. I started domestication 11 segments into day 2, and finished domestication 3 segments into day 23. That's a domestication time of 20 days and 8 segments. Those 8 segments represent 240 seconds, which means through those 20 days and 8 segments, I missed about 24 domestication ticks out of 984. Only missing 2% of domestication ticks is pretty darn good. I hope you found that quick Beefalo taming playthrough helpful. If you're a beginner or even an intermediate, Beefalo taming can be hard, as not only are you trying to survive yourself, but you're also trying to manage a Beefalo, which can be too much to handle at once. If that's you, then I'd probably say ignore Beefalo taming until you've gotten quite good at just surviving yourself. But surviving can be made easier with a Beefalo once its ride time has been increased to a minute, which is about 4 days of domestication completed. So you know what you need to know, perhaps give it a go and see how you find it. I was never a fan of taming Beefalo, but now I am a casual enjoyer of a rider Beefalo in my rushes. Let's talk about DPS real quick. Despite Beefalo being able to deal up to 68 damage, that doesn't mean they're the same DPS as a Dark Sword. Beefalo attacks slower than the player, even while riding them, one attack every 0.533 seconds, whereas a player attacks about once every 0.466 seconds, meaning Beefalo attack 12.5% slower than the player, leading their DPS to be, that's it, 12.5% less, despite them being able to achieve 68 damage per attack, the same as the Dark Sword. But this slower attack speed can be leveled out by animation cancelling. Whether you animation cancel as a player on foot or on a Beefalo, you'll be able to achieve the same faster attack speed of one attack every 0.4 seconds, which is 16.67% faster than a player's normal attack speed, and 33.33% faster than a Beefalo's normal attack speed. So Beefalo benefit greatly from animation cancelling, but if you're not into that, I get it, no problem. Character synergies. Some characters innately work much better with Beefalo than others, so in this section I'm going to mention all the characters that get extra value out of Beefalo compared to someone like Wilson. Beefalo do not inherit damage multipliers from characters. This means Wes and Wendy will not pass on their reduced damage to the Beefalo, along with characters like Wolfgang not passing the double damage onto the Beefalo. This leads us to our first synergy, Wendy. Wendy normally deals 0.75 times damage, but when fighting with Abigail, Abigail applies a Vex, which makes Wendy gain a 1.1 times and 1.4 times multiplier, which ends up making her damage equivalent to 1.155 times. When Wendy is on a Beefalo though, the 0.75 times damage modifier does not get passed on, but the Beefalo still benefits from the 1.1 times and 1.4 times damage multipliers. This multiplies an untamed Beefalo's damage with a default saddle from 34 to 52.36, so Wendy effectively has access to ornery damage without needing to fully domesticate the Beefalo. When the Beefalo is domesticated into an ornery Beefalo, its damage goes from 50 to 77, and if that Beefalo uses a nightmare saddle, it will go all the way from 68 to 93 damage per attack. Since the 16 planar damage from the saddle is planar, it doesn't get amplified by Abigail's Vex, but it's still really good. This means for maximum damage versus a non-planar enemy, you might want to consider a war saddle, as that setup will deal 101.64 damage per hit. Wormwood is a character who can be harder to heal than other characters since he cannot heal from eating food. Using a Beefalo to avoid small amounts of damage in the early game is welcomed until until you have a renewable healing source like honey poultice or bat bats. Wormwood's perk, Bramble Husk Specialist, also triggers when on a Beefalo on every third attack, but the husk doesn't trigger when the Beefalo takes a hit. This sprinkles in some air effect damage while attacking on your Beefalo. The Beefalo's constant generation of poop also gives Wormwood a passive way to regenerate health. Maxwell has a lower max health of 75, so welcomes a comfy 1000 health meat shield, and as Maxwell does most of his fighting with shadow puppets, the theoretical reduction in DPS with a Beefalo versus melee weapons is negligible. Wigfrid has a branch in her skill tree related to Beefalo, including increasing the value of domestication ticks by 15% so you gain domestication faster, riding the Beefalo for longer, making the saddle we talked about, and gaining inspiration while on the Beefalo. I would go for a rider Beefalo on Wigfrid and then fight with her Elding Spear. Wolfgang's synergy is just one thing, is he moves fast with his leg day skill because it affects the Beefalo speed, which is weird, but hey, it works. Woody has one synergy, which is his quick picker skill carries over to when riding a Beefalo to pick things faster. Otherwise, any character can benefit from a rider Beefalo simply by traveling around the map fast, unless they have speed themselves like WX78, or have teleportation like Wartox, Wanda, and perhaps even Winona. Or you can tame an Ornery Beefalo for comfy fighting with speed and a meat shield. I'm looking at you, PlayStation and Xbox players. They have an Xbox probably. If you're playing on a controller, my goodness, the controls are horrific, so use a Beefalo, it will be easier. Lastly, we have some tips from other Beefalo enjoyers who wanted to contribute to this guide, and all very kindly reviewed this script. Lardy, the Beefalo master himself, has a few extra tips to share. Lardy reminded me of how powerful the passive poop generation is from a Beefalo, and I mentioned that tip at the start of this video. Thanks, Lardy. They also added that pairing a Windbolt with a Beefalo means Windbolt will always pick up the Beefalo's poop and put it away in a chest. If you're playing Wormwood, this poop can be used as a passive way to regenerate health. You can only hold one bonded Beefalo Bell at a time, but you can bring an extra Beefalo with you by putting the second Beefalo Bell in Chester or any other moving container like Wobie. If your Beefalo is the wrong tendency and you estimate that the Beefalo is going to hit 100% domestication soon, you can intentionally hit the Beefalo to reduce its domestication by 30%. This will give you more time to accumulate the desired tendency points before the Beefalo locks in with the wrong tendency. And last tip from Lardy, on the last stage of Assault Lick before it breaks, you can hammer it to recover some resources in preparation to build a new one. Arkwell also reviewed this script thoroughly and corrected a bunch of numbers in it, thanks Arkwell. They also had a fun bug to share. If you let your Beefalo lick a Salt Lick once, then ride it away, the domestication loss pausing effect will stay active forever until you switch in or out of the caves or disconnect. Alint from my Twitch chat gave a few tips, starting with a quick tip about guessing how domesticated your Beefalo is without using mods. When your Beefalo is not shaved or in heat, time how long it takes for your Beefalo to buck you off in seconds. Subtract 15 from that number and divide the result by 225. This gives you the decimal, aka percentage, of your domestication. This would mean if your Beefalo bucked you off after 90 seconds, it would be 1/3 of the way, or 33.3% domesticated. Alint credited Jazzy for sharing this tip in a YouTube video of his. I will link that in the description. When you carry a heavy object with a fully tamed Beefalo, that Beefalo may then beg for food. This is a bug and it's not an indication that your Beefalo is low domestication or anything. Tamed Beefalo should never beg for food, even if they're about to become undomesticated. If Woody's Weremoose charges toward a Beefalo, it will hit the Beefalo even if that Beefalo is tamed and saddled, resulting in a 30% domestication loss. So don't carelessly charge around if you're playing Woody. Mr. Giglio is a Maxwell Beefalo enjoyer and came to me with this tip. This tip requires a wild Beefalo because if you did it with your normal Beefalo, it will cause some domestication loss. But here's how you get some very early rot using a wild Beefalo. Grab a wild Beefalo and then feed it 4 steamed twigs. This will max out its hunger. Then keep repeatedly feeding it twigs or grass, whatever is cheaper for you. Grass give half the hunger of twigs, but regardless, each time you feed the Beefalo, it will push its hunger above maximum, which will cause it to puke. This of course makes it lose 1% domestication, but if it's a wild Beefalo, then you don't really care about that. So keep your actual tamed Beefalo separate. Then you could effectively trade 1 twig or 1 grass for a rot every time you feed the Beefalo, and you can get a whole stack of rot or multiple stacks of rot relatively fast. This is good for early game rot for fertilizing plants, or crafting recipes, or if you're playing Wormwood. Thanks, Mr. Giglio. And that's all. Thank you for watching, and big thank you to all the gamers who reviewed, added to, and corrected my script. And of course, thanks for giving us their Beefalo knowledge in the form of tips and strategies. These gamers are Lardy137, Arkwell, Lord Lee, Alint, and Mr. Giglio. All their channels are linked in the description. Hopefully this is a complete guide and I didn't forget anything. If you have any tips or strategies, then drop them in the comments below to share with your fellow survivors. Thank you again, and a new update just here, so I'm gonna go rush the boss with like Wartox Walter and Wendy. Alright, goodbye.